Thank you and welcome to the final session of the Climate Adaptation Seminar Series, Climate Change, Drought, and Wildfire, the application of climate-informed and user-driven responses for post-fire reforestation in California, presented by Dr. Stephen Ostoja, USDA Climate Hub, the Muir Institute of the Environment, and the Climate Adaptation Research Center. Just a little bit about the Climate Adaptation Research Center. It's a new center on campus that strives to facilitate multidisciplinary academic research, to engage with communities, businesses, and policymakers, and to provide diverse learning experiences in order to identify, evaluate, and advance solutions to adapt to a changing climate and deliver a resilient and prosperous world. So we're going to start off with a few virtual notes. As mentioned, this is hosted by the UC Davis Climate Adaptation Research Center. All attendees are in listen-only mode. If you have any problems during the webinar, please let us know. Type it in the chat or the Q&A and we will get right back to you. If you'd like to chat with the other attendees, I encourage you to change your chat to all panelists and attendees. And this meeting is being recorded so that you can share it with your colleagues after the session has concluded. Now I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Ostoja. He is a native Californian who earned his BS in ecology and MS in biological sciences from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. He then went on to earn his PhD in ecology and conservation biology from Utah State University, where his research focused on the effects of invasive species on wildlife communities and resource consumer interactions in an applied rangeland restoration context. Before joining the USDA Climate Hub, Steve worked for the U.S. Forest Service, where he was head of the Ecosystem Management Department on the Sierra National Forest. And prior to that, he worked as a supervisory ecologist for the U.S. Geological Survey in the Yosemite office, where he managed a research program that focused on invasive species management, restoration ecology, conservation biology, and the effects of various stressors, including climate change, to plant and animal populations and communities. Steve joined the USDA Climate California Hub in September of 2016 and the Climate Adaptation Research Center this past year when it was started. Welcome, Steve. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge today. I will let you go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Andrew. Let me just transition to my screen here. So can you see it okay?
Yes, looks great.
Great, thanks. So I'm not going to, thanks again for joining. Thanks for having me. I'm pleased to be a part of this research center and of course, the community at UC Davis. I'll talk just a little bit about the Climate Hub program in a moment for context of what else I'll be sharing in today's seminar or today's talk. So one of the things about it, so I'm also happen to be the science advisory panel co-chair of Governor Newsom's Forest Management Task Force, which I'll talk about at the very end of my talk. So there's some context there as well about the application of post-fire response and reforestation as well when we start talking about that task force and the resilience action plan that's associated with that. That's essentially our roadmap for moving ahead. So there's a few hats that are being worn, like I'm sure all of us that are on the call here this morning. I guess maybe if you're on the East Coast, it's this afternoon, but otherwise for us out West, it's this morning. So the USDA California Climate Hub is one of, as you can, whoops, sorry about that, is one of 10 locations across the country. Our program focuses on within the natural and working land sector, primarily production agriculture. I'd say about half of the portfolio is focused on kind of climate adaptation science and applied climate science needs for production agriculture. And the other half, if not more, is focused on kind of forestry kind of the natural part of the working lands term. The basic underlying theme here is that the USDA Climate Hubs are the applied climate science program for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Of course, we've probably been in the news more. Well, we definitely have been in the news more in the last couple months than we were the previous 4 years, which is certainly a good thing. It's very exciting for us. But at our core, we try to bridge the generative community of the academics, which is why being on campus at UC Davis is so lovely, to the practitioner or the application of the individuals that are on the ground. So we work at that inner space. And really what we're trying to do is inform decision-making. So we come at this with the end user in mind. And in that, if we can help with resources, products, any kind of information technologies, et cetera, that enable decision-making, we feel like that's the kind of that ideal space that we really want to be working at. So we spend a lot of time kind of grappling with kind of that dynamic. For today's talk, I'll start off with, obviously we're going to be focused on the, really applied reforestation. So I'm not going to talk about, the reforestation strategy or any of those types of things, however important they are. I'm really going to kind of do the roll your sleeves up on reforestation. And in this sense, we're really going to be thinking about climate informed reforestation. And, I'll talk about kind of the context of California's changing dynamic, changing landscape, changing climate, increased disturbances, increased climate mediated stretches, et cetera, in just a second. But we're really going to look at essentially a suite of case studies, if you will, that we're working again with scientists and managers, and then have taken that input from those engagements and have a series of essentially products or case studies, if you will, that have come out of that are essentially being used now today. We have a whole number. We're trying to build on this, which I'm unfortunately not going to get into in this talk, looking ahead, but reforestation is one of the primary objectives that's supported in that forest management resilience plan that you can simply find online if you just Google California Forest Management Task Force. So, and then I'll just spend a minute looking ahead. So, a lot of this work really was ignited or really kicked off during the 2012-2016 drought. You can see that figure on the left, which is the Palmer Drought Severity Index. I know there are concerns about which drought index to use, but this talk is not about disentangling appropriate drought metrics. But you can see that 2014 dip there was essentially the most significant California drought in 1,200 years, according to Blue Oak Tree Ring records. And you can see the depiction of the kind of the drought severity across the bottom of the screen there in each of those 5 years. We're in that again after last year, where we had rather hot and also dry year, and we're certainly in it this year, where most of the state is in exceptional or extreme drought conditions. So, we never know what the future is going to bring. But the reason that I have this term mega drought is that we're kind of, there's a community of scientists that are working between the idea of we're in periodic drought or we're in a period of increased aridity. Which can have just the way that you think about that and the way that you assess those effects associated with whether these are periodic droughts or a trajectory of increased aridity with increased warming and change in the form of precipitation, and the amount of precipitation changes the way you think about your application of your approach. But in any regard, the drought certainly is kind of taken together, where you kind of think of the duration of the drought that's shown in the top of that figure on the right that I just was put up on the screen. Increased temperature going from cooler to wetter, precipitation change going from obviously wet to dry, and then drought intensity going from low to high. So that last drought was what we call a hot drought. It certainly essentially takes the individuals in an ecosystem and puts them kind of stresses them, constrains them, and forces them out of their comfortable physiologic, ecologic niche. And that's exactly what we saw in that last drought period, which we're still understanding the implications and ramifications of, even as recently as just last fire season, which we'll get into in just a second. But this is something, we know ecosystems change. We expect that to happen, but the pace and magnitude that we're seeing changes is certainly unprecedented in the at least recent history. And of course, warmer temperature and drought puts trees at risk, and we're going to be talking largely about trees. We lost about 130 million trees in that drought. We've lost a lot of oak trees related to certainly a sudden oak death in large swaths of California. We've experiencing increased mortality of oaks due to the gold-spotted shot-collared borer in Southern California. We definitely have ecosystems that are at risk, and we are seeing disturbances and increased stress on those ecosystems as a function of climate-mediated dynamics. I'm not going to get into this, but there's certainly a backstory to this, right? So I kind of term it the ghost of management past. So there are activities in the past that in different ways contributed to increased susceptibility to stress, like the essentially elimination of fire is one of those, and other land management practices. Certainly not pursued with ill intent in mind, but I think we retrospectively understand that they also contributed to some of the dynamic that we're seeing. But again, I'm not going to get into that here today. And then we look ahead. So these are some projections of what California can expect to see. And you can see that the temperatures are certainly going to increase. So these were done for at least the three of the figures, the graphs were done for the Davis region. So they don't necessarily apply to the Sierra Nevada, just to make that, or any other mountainous region where we have large expanses of conifers. But you can see that even there, we're going to have large increases in temperature. In the average annual temperature, we're going to see a reduction of the low temperature and more acutely, and then of course the maximum. Extreme heat events are certainly hugely significant, especially at the lower elevation forest bands where we see our yellow pine forests that of course are adapted to arid conditions and routine fire. But that's going to reshape a lot of what California looks like, certainly looking out toward the end of the century. You can see the number of extreme heat events will go up significantly looking out. We see that the average area burned is going to increase a lot, and of course increased extreme precipitation events through largely atmospheric river events. We're also going to lose our snow reservoir looking out. We have relied on that for a whole suite of different applications in the state, not the least of which are domestic interests, hydroelectric generation, but also ecological integrity. It will strain the stability of some of these ecosystems that are dependent on snow melt as part of their water delivery mechanism. And that figure on the right basically just shows the projected shift in snow, essentially that snow line, right? That kind of rain to snow line. And those are just three lines in the Sierra Nevada, Southern Sierra Nevada, Central, and then North. Of course, the Southern Sierra Nevada is quite high, some of the highest peaks in the state. So we will retain some snow reservoir in that part of the state looking out. So as I mentioned, there are kind of linked effects here. And essentially on the top, we have kind of climate-driven stress disturbance shown through higher temperatures, longer, more severe droughts. When trees are stressed, they become susceptible to pests, including bark beetles. That can lead to increased tree mortality, which we saw. As I mentioned, we had the dynamic of fire suppression, where we had unnaturally high stand density in many expanses of California forest systems. That increased density with tree mortality led to a greater abundance of large, even 1,000-hour fuels, like we haven't seen in any time in in the past, which has led to large severe fires. So we now know that this is not a could, but it has. We had 2020 fire events, which we'll talk about in just a second. And we've had not just severe fires, but extreme severe fires that are leaving fire effects that have not been assessed yet. So I want to speak out of place, but certainly there are scientists looking at the effect of the 2020 fire season as a function of this fuel loading dynamic. And we have to understand that in order to know what's the best application for reforestation restoration looking ahead. In some cases, we're already seeing type change, right? So natural communities change in time. They change in function to a lot of dynamics, and we're seeing that in California. But certainly some alternative communities are, I would say, let's just say, have a greater societal value and ecological value, if you will, than others, and we can manage that transition. So it's just something to keep in mind as we move ahead. And one of the ways that you can do that is through reforestation. In some cases, maybe it's not reforesting, it's the same thing that was there previously, but transitioning it to a different ecotype or plant association type, sorry about that, that would have, that is likely to be better suited than what was there previously, given the changed bioclimatic envelope. So one of the things that we have now witnessed, but was predicted, were mass fires. So this figure on the right was done by a colleague of ours, Dr. Scott Stephen and then John Battles, who's my co-chair actually of the Science Advisory Panel, both at University of California, Berkeley. So you can kind of see that figure on the right side of the screen where it shows the biomass accumulation of live in green, standing dead in red, and then the relationship of the standing dead to those 1,000-hour fuels that I mentioned. So we had that essentially that 2012-2016 die-off event really started in I think it kind of peaked at 2015. So we had a lot of standing dead trees. In the years since, those trees have started coming down. Interestingly enough, that the wind events are not kind of characteristic of the Sierra Nevada or a lot of California ecosystems, aside from the Southern California chaparral and shrublands with Santa Ana wind dynamic, but they are in the Southern Sierra. And they've put down a lot of trees maybe sooner than one would expect based on natural decay processes. And what we've seen now as a function of some of the large fires that we've had is that that fuel accumulation has led to large expanses of high intensity, high severity fire patches that certainly kind of reshape how you think and then approach the post-fire response accordingly. And of course, we're not done yet. But before we get there, I kind of want to highlight 3 fires where they were, large, destructive, and unfortunately deadly, and where reforestation is a necessary set of actions for the kind of the response portfolio, including reforestation, is required so that we get these systems on a trajectory where they have some semblance of ecological integrity function, they meet various societal values. And the first of which, and those of you that are in the Sacramento area, the Davis area, certainly I remember the morning driving to campus and looking out to my right and seeing this huge plume out in the distance, and lo and behold, it ended up being the campfire. It was about, I'd say, 6:45 in the morning. That fire ended up, killing more people than any other fire in the state's history. It was also the most destructive fire in terms of the property loss. It was about 150,000 acres in size. So certainly a very, very large fire. Sadly, we have much larger fires now going on in California. Started on federal land, largely burned into private land, mixed ownership types. And there are some really interesting, which we're not going to unfortunately look at today, reforestation efforts going on with RCDs, federal partners, and others. They're in the campfire burn scar. The next fire, which really was a heartbreak to me, having spent so much time in my career in this part of the Sierra Nevada, was the Creek Fire. So this was just about 380,000 acres. That's a big footprint. mainly burning on the Sierra National Forest, not exclusively, but largely. It was the largest single incident fire. It's the so it's not the largest fire. It's not a part of a complex, if you will, like a lot of the large fires in California, where there were individual ignitions, individual incidents, and they kind of came together to form a complex. This was not a complex. Huge areas of extreme fire intensity. Our program has been working with the forest staff here on reforestation framework, and both engaging the district staff and engaging tribal communities, or we're starting to engage tribal communities about restoration or post-fire response priorities. So that's in the works now. In fact, working with my colleague who took this picture, province ecologist Anne-Marie Winchell, on that effort. And then, another one that was heartbreaking, smaller than the creek certainly, but certainly devastating. This is the Sequoia complex fire, also the Castle fire, it was formerly known as. It was also another area of high tree mortality. This is drone imagery taken from USGS, University of Nevada, Reno, looking at some giant sequoias there that had burned at high intensity. So these are fire effects that are, really, really unique. They're burning at super high intensity. They leave fire effects that are, largely different than the moderate, patchy, moderate, mixed severity that we might otherwise see, where we have some patches of unburned areas. So these are large expanses of burned areas that really impact the soils, they impact the biochemical dynamics going on edaphically below ground, that we really, really need to take a fine look at to understand, so that we can apply the right solution set given that impact. So the urgency, in my mind, is clear, but obviously we need to go through that. So when you burn an area, the clock starts ticking, and you can see a colleague of mine, Ryan Tompkins, who was formerly with Plumas National Forest, is now a cooperative extension advisor at the UC system, speaking to a group of folks where we held an event several years ago, trying to illustrate that dynamic. There's already a reforestation backlog, at least in the agency and on private land, presumably, but that's harder to track. We have a lot of area now with forest cover loss that demands some attention in terms of forest management applications, including potentially reforestation. Climate change in many instances is kind of reshaping the menu of appropriate alternatives when you think about reforestation. As I mentioned, in some cases, bioclimatic envelope is kind of being squeezed or squeezing out the formerly occupied sites of that species composition and demanding a new complement being considered. As I showed in that kind of interactive graphic, which I forgot to cite, unfortunately, I apologize for that, also puts you at risk of cascading effects, which we won't get into here, but there's a huge demand. This is one of the the 5 primary priorities that's come out of the governor's Forest Management Task Force that's articulated in the Forest Resilience Action Plan, which you can find online. But reforestation is a big deal, and I think you're going to see a lot of good science and a lot of applied outcomes coming out of California in the years to come. But this what I'm going to present today kind of scratches the surface of that. So as I mentioned, we start with listen, right? We start with, and we listen to the people that are doing the reforestation. So the people that you see there on the screen are 4 silviculturalists. They are the individuals responsible for planning, prioritizing, identifying the need of reforestation out in the units of which they are charged with overseeing. We held a 2-day dialogue event where we really tried to work at that interface between the practitioners, the applied managers, and the science community, and really see where those linkages were. It was a really well-attended event. We're actually thinking about, excuse me, planning another one, a variation of this theme, but looking more acutely at fire effects as part of that consideration. And it was an incredibly useful event and really kicked off some of the work, did kick off some of the work that I'll be presenting in just a moment here. We also held just a Reforestation Summit some months after. So these were, we invited some of the primary scientists. Some of you might recognize those faces. You see Kristen Shives there, and next to John Battles, who Kristen's now the lead forest scientist at the Nature Conservancy. John, I mentioned, is at UC Berkeley. This event was really the brainchild of Malcolm North, who's a PSW scientist, and Malcolm and I, with Hugh Safford, Forest Service, worked together to put this Reforestation Research Summit together. Out of it, we developed this paper that's essentially Reforestation for Resilience. It's in the review paper in Forest Ecology and Management. There's I think it's still it couldn't be more on point than right now, even though it was published a couple of years ago. And there's some interesting suggestions that I'd like to walk through out of that. And there are a few suggested approaches or consideration when engaging in reforestation. Obviously, you can't reforest everything, or it's just not appropriate. It's you don't have the capacity. It's either too dangerous. It's just the resources don't make that suitable means of proceeding. So we've come up with various considerations: seed zonation, thinking differently about density and spatial arrangement, looking at the species composition, the application of fire in young stands. So this idea of pyrosilviculture, which I'm not going to get into, but is very important, especially in these fire-dependent ecosystems, and then thinking about future site suitability. So you can see we essentially have kind of a three-zone approach. So you can see that if you see the A's in green there, you have those kind of, you want to be able to work with the natural recruitment. So you have that nearby in the lower portion of the screen where you have living trees that can provide that crop fuel, the seed into this burned area where you might have regeneration able to take place. In that second zone, which is B, it's beyond effective seed dispersal range, but it's still accessible. Managers can get there, it's safe. So you can plant in essentially in a combination of clustered and regularly spaced seedlings that can vary with their microsite water availability and potential future fire behavior. And then we have this final zone, which is essentially defined by really remote, very steep terrain that really limits the application of reforestation efforts. So here you might want to think about the establishment of founder stands. So small discrete patches that hopefully can mature and provide seed availability into the future. So here you can kind of see what some of those look like. I'll walk through these rather quickly. You can see on the left, that's some private land that was planted after the Moonlight Fire in 2007, and on one side of the road, the left, and then on the right was some Forest Service land that has not been either thinned or replanted. You can see what this kind of essentially the ICO individual clumps and openings look like early on in their post-fire, post-restoration early establishment. You can see here some regularly planted trees in a plantation. And then the lower right is essentially what you get with a natural fire, active fire regime. And this is a photo taken from the San Pedro Martir in Baja, Mexico. So you can kind of see there's openings, there's scattered individuals, and there are clumps in that photograph. So that came out of those two dialogues. So the second part of this is we did develop what we're calling a climate-wise toolkit. It has essentially 3 parts. It's online now, it can be used. It's just for the US Forest Service in the Southern Cascades Sierra region as a function of increased forest cover loss resulting from tree mortality and now, unfortunately, fires. And has, like I mentioned, 3 parts: the reforestation prioritization tool, which you're seeing on the screen now, a post-drought stand condition tool, which I'm not going to look at today, and then a set of best management practices, which were largely born out of that previous paper that I had just spoke to a moment ago, which you can peruse on your leisure if you're so interested. But again, this is applicability to California Forest Service units specifically, but might be a means of how you think about this in your own locations or your own situation looking ahead. But it allows the user to kind of self-select the units of interest for them in terms of reforestation. And you can see, you can get some areas, and it's a little difficult to see, but just going through some of the layers that I had selected in terms of the level of mechanical constraint and the drought risk, you can see some portions there. Right there at the Kern-Tulare County line. So this is in the Sequoia National Forest. There are some areas that give you essentially a 3rd level, 2nd level, or 1st level prioritization in terms of reforestation need. So it's not really something that you would go and print out, of course, and take with you in the field and plant those trees out. But it's something that the managers can use early on in the planning process post-disturbance to think about how you would design reforestation prescriptions as part of some larger planning document. So we think it's been pretty useful, and the forests are still actively using this, especially now after the Creek Fire and the Sequoia Complex Fire, unfortunately. I was going to show a demo of this, but given the time, I'm not going to. I'll just quickly mention, these are hot links on the screens. But you can simply go to the USDA Climate Hub webpage and find both the tool, and we've also started to curate other reforestation resources. These are frameworks, tools, decision support tools, not all for reforestation. For example, we have one in there that's specific for projecting regeneration potential, right? So identifying sites on a landscape that are likely to regenerate naturally without a lot of management input, which is certainly what we want to know when we think about where we need to go, is identifying the sites that don't need attention as well. But just in the interest of time, I'm not going to be able to demo these. So the third thing that the third and I think final thing that I'd like to look at was that you can't reforest if you don't have plant material. You can't reforest if you don't have the seed. In early conversations with Region 5 silviculturalists, one of the concerns was that forest cover was being lost, really kind of at a landscape level, that we were losing the resources, the cone seeds, to potentially reforest in other locations, or in those locations post-disturbance in the years to come. So we wanted to design a framework for them by which that they could identify, monitor, and potentially collect seed resources for storage and later use when there was a reforestation demand. So we have this reforestation prioritization framework, which is essentially, it's not a tool in the sense that it's kind of web-based or ArcGIS based, but it is a series of maps that a manager can use to go through this multi-step process, which I'll take you through. This is, again, only done for the U.S. Forest Service. It's done for only California and Region 5, all 18 Forest Service units. We've just selected a handful of ecologically and economically important trees. But we are, the colleague of mine at UC Davis, Dr. Jim Thorne, he and I worked on this project together with a couple of other postdocs. Excuse me, we are looking at expanding this to the entire state of California. If this is something that's of interest to your part of the world, please reach out so we can kind of share our approach with how we thought about this and what the outputs look like for you if this resonates at all. Let me just walk through this here. So the first two steps are, of course, getting the distribution of the species, right? So getting the layer of where the species are and clipping that to the district level within a Forest Service unit. Shown on the right side of your screen is then taking the ponderosa pine in this case, and then throwing on top of that its future projected climate exposure, right? The idea here is that and we don't know this, but we wanted to identify sites that had trees that were still living on the landscape, didn't suffer mortality per that drought, and are still alive from other factors, bark beetle infestation, but are in the margins of their kind of bioclimatic envelope. And you can see that in the red and yellow, right? So these are some of the areas we were really looking at in these highly exposed sites that were still living, still intact stands that we wanted to identify for potential collection. Then the third step of that is to essentially clip for access and access accessibility, right? Forests are steep, they're rugged, can be dangerous places to walk through off trail. So we essentially wanted to put 500-meter buffers around transportation lines, around Forest Service roads, so that forest managers could get there, could watch for cone maturation, and then in the event they get a cone crop, can collect, right? There's no point identifying locations randomly scattered around the forest that are just simply not accessible, that individuals just can't get to. And then we did a reality check. So we used the NAPE imagery from the Farm Services Agency that does that. It's a National Agriculture Imagery Project. I can never remember that acronym. I apologize, but it's freely available online. And then we superimposed our projections and our assessment on top of the imagery to ensure that the trees were in fact still living, right? So again, these are all layers that are readily available for Forest Service managers, unfortunately only. But as I mentioned, we're trying to do this, or Jim's trying to do this for the entire state of California. It may have applicability in other locations. But these were resources that went out then to all our forest managers, all our silviculturalists, including the regional office in Vallejo, so that they had these resources available to them to help them identify, or their contractors identify, places to look for, places to watch, and a means to potentially collect and then get those resources to the Placerville Nursery, or potentially even the LA Moran Cal Fire Nursery here in Davis, California. So it's kind of a really neat project, and I'm looking forward to seeing that one be expanded to the state of California. So this is my final slide. I'll just conclude. As I mentioned, the state of California's task force has evolved. It started as a tree mortality task force. It then went into the forest management task force, and now after the 2020 fires, really kind of pivoted, if you will, to be very action oriented. Now we have the California Wildfire and Forest Resilient Action Plan. You can find this simply by Googling Forest Management Task Force, or the plan's title. We've got 4 goals that all have actions assigned to those goals. This is very much in the spirit of collaboration and leaning in across agencies, organizations, private landowners, etc. I'm very excited to be a part of this. It's a very bold effort. I often say when I visit with groups, not just nationally, but internationally, California is really leading the way in its response to climate change. It's really exciting to be a part of this. Obviously, we've never done some of what we're doing before, so we're certainly learning to some degree as we go. But I'll note, if this is something that's of interest to you to watch, certainly watching from the lessons that come from this dynamic is very useful. I've put here the task force meetings for the future. I believe they're open to the public. They're led by Secretary Wade Crowfoot, Secretary of Natural Resources, and the Regional Forester Randy Moore, U.S. Forest Service Region 5. So with that, I will conclude. I hope I'm okay on time, Sandra, and if there are any questions, I can take them. Thank you for having me today.
Wonderful. Yeah, we've got lots of time. So we do have one question so far. I'll let others start typing theirs into the Q&A box or the chat if you have them.
Yeah.
But for this first question, it is, are there any of these reforestation or seed collection efforts coordinated in partnership with tribal governments?
Right. No, so that's a really good question. I don't know. There's so much going on in California. I'm not going to pretend to know all of the various activities or dynamics. So I don't know, but I would assume so. The one thing I can say that I mentioned in passing is that we're in the middle of a project on the Sierra National Forest where we are going to have essentially listening to native and tribal leaders in and around the Sierra National Forest related to the creek fire incident, so we can identify where they prioritize or envision wanting some sort of response activities to take place. In terms of seed collection efforts, I don't know that specifically, but I can kind of, I can ask around and see what I learn. It's a good question. Certainly needs to be addressed. And we're certainly trying to identify these kind of culturally significant areas, or at least have some insight in terms of how those sites or locations would like to be used by tribal communities, so that then can be built into forest management response plans, so that they're incorporating those needs. It's a good question. Certainly something that's on our minds. But yeah. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. We have another question though. Ian is asking, how much human power is this going to take in the coming decades? Is it reasonable to call for a massive public works efforts to get all this reforestation of the US West done?
Yeah, it's not trivial, right? So Ian's spot on. Yes, it is. As many of you are maybe even more aware than I, the Biden-Harris administration has called for a workforce initiative in the form of the Civilian Climate Corps. So there's a potential applicability there. There's another bill that's being passed, I believe, through the Senate. I can't remember the individual's name, as well as Senator Feinstein, who's pushing forth a workforce development plan. I don't know, I don't track all of what's going on in DC as well as I should as a federal scientist, but definitely there's going to be a need for human capital in this. And I think there's a lot of opportunity because there's just no way to get it done otherwise. It's too big of a task. So it's a super good question. And I think, when we start thinking about, organizations like ours in the Climate Hub program are, as you can imagine, tapped to kind of think about how we can suggest approaches for the Civilian Climate Corps. And I think, what you saw here today makes the need that there's a potential way that we can build into that human capital to get these locations reforested.
Great.
So I see there's also a question in the chat, Sandra, about how is monitoring data used to validate wildfire CO2 emission estimates? That's a California Air Resources Board question. I don't know. I'm just going to be completely honest how they're doing that. I know Air Resources Board is doing that. I believe that there might be, I think there's an individual in the National Forest Systems, what's called the RSL lab, which is the remote sensing lab, who's also looking at this. His name is escaping me. Lee Tarnay. I think he's looking at some of that. I'm sure many other people are. I don't know the answer to it, unfortunately. I'm sorry. I'm not going to pretend that.
We have another chat question.
Oh, okay.
Can you touch on the use of compost for fire remediation?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, compost has been suggested and so has biochar. I have to admit, I don't know. I don't know. I would, if you could put more light on that, April. The introduction of materials. So any kind of activity post-fire, right, triggers an environmental, the national, what am I trying to say here? Essentially triggers an environmental act. The terms escaping me, I'm sorry, NEPA, right? And how compost has been used or not used. In federal land, I have no idea. In private land, I have no idea either. It's an interesting question. I don't even know what that would end up looking like, truthfully. Sorry, no, I'm not doing too well with the questions. I apologize.
You're getting a lot of ideas of other things to research, it sounds like.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, April, if you wanted to put anything in chat to expand upon that, we can take a look. Other questions?
You know, we're certainly interested in kind of bridging divides, right? So one of the things that we've done in the past, and the state of California actually has an MOU with the states of Oregon and Washington, as well as British Columbia, Canada, to kind of share successes and learn from lessons and roadblocks and what have you. And I think more of that will be coming together in the future. Looks like we have an air pollution meteorologist. So these are good questions for an air pollution meteorologist. So let's see. I'll just read this, Andrea. As an air pollution meteorologist, I've been involved in suppression of prescribed in wildfire in the past. What is your opinion of weighing immediate environmental consequences of fire and mechanical treatments for future forest health and reduction of wildfires? So there's a lot in this, right? Obviously. So, you know, I think we have to be cognizant of where we are now as a function of decisions that were made in the past, and mindful of that. What are the appropriate applications, management applications to that may have some short-term environmental or ecological consequence, but can mitigate future fire, the severity of future fire. You know, unfortunately, I'm not the one that is kind of set out to find that balance. It's certainly a good question, Ian. I'm not. It's more of a kind of a conversation over beer at a bar. You know, so maybe I'll just say, because I'm not going to be able to answer the question that is commensurate with the with how it's been asked, but I will say that these are fire dependent systems we're talking about, right? So these are systems that have kind of compromised ecological processes as a function of past activities, management activities, past decisions that need our intervention in some cases to get those not just processes but functions back intact. Perfect. You know, and it's I mean, it's such a tricky balance, and that's such a broad question too, that it's like it's one that depends. But in many cases we need to do something, and we need to do more at scale so that we can get the system not just looking the way that kind of we think it should look, you know, in that kind of traditional sense of desired conditions, but more functioning how it should function for the suite of processes that, you know, to be intact, to serve the many benefits that we need to see out of these. I don't know, it's kind of I'm not answering it very well. It's a great question. I'd love to have a beer with you and talk about that. So there's another question in there, Sandra, too.
We have one in the chat, or in the Q&A.
Yeah,
Ian?
There is actually. So, you know, so there's an effort that's going on. So everyone's probably familiar on this call with the California seed zones, right? So California has different seed zones, different polygons, if you will, that essentially identify what species should go where. there is an allowance, kind of I don't know if it's an official U.S. Forest Service handbook guidance to have an allowance for essentially, I believe it's 500 feet outside of that seed zone. In the past, a lot of different things have been planted there, so we find all the time of different forest silviculturists planting, say, giant sequoia in places where it did, at least recently, we know it probably was there 10,000 years ago, but recently didn't support giant sequoia. That seed zone mapping exercise is being redone. It's being redone so it takes climate change into consideration. It's species specific. And the delineations are a function of meaningful ecological considerations and not just kind of, rivers or roads or other kind of delineations, county lines that that kind of don't really make sense moving ahead in terms of thinking about this ecologically. There's a lot of conversation about assisted migration, right? And how that gets folded into forest management is kind of forest by forest, unit by unit, or private landowner by private landowner. We're certainly looking at this. It's certainly a hot topic. But yeah, so it's, the answer is yes. And I can send, there's a couple papers on this that are out. There's also one thing that we've done that we didn't talk about today is there's a California Forest Ecosystems Adaptation menu that our program put together with in partnership with the Forest Service. And so it's basically a menu of adaptation strategies, kind of high level, not very pointed approaches that have a little more resolution, and then practices like on the ground things that people can do. And one of the strategies, I don't even remember what number it is, I think it's strategy 9 or 11, is all about assisted migration. And that's all it covers. And it tries to do it for all of California forest ecosystems, regardless of ownership type. And it's a menu, right? So there's different ideas or suggested practices that might have applicability in one context or another, but not all. And that's something that's also on our website. You could probably just Google California forest ecosystems. She already found it. You're amazing. That's what I was telling you before we started. I'm so impressed by you, Sandra. Do it again. Yeah, it's an important one, right? Especially when you kind of look at the essentially the modeled bioclimatic future or exposure of some of the lower elevation or kind of lower productivity sites across the forest systems in California, and it doesn't look like a bright future for them. So starting to think about that alternative plant assemblance is really important. The tricky thing about that is we're not really well set up for at scale adjusting based on that need, right? In some cases, these are non-conifer species like oaks that may be better suited in the future. And oak acorns don't store, right? They need to be grown out essentially as seedlings and then redistributed to either the Forest Service or private landowners to get back in the ground. It's a great question and a great problem to have. And it also is a function of the appetite per the individuals, if they're willing to kind of think differently about their location. With different forest managers will answer that question very differently. No, can the reforestation strategy in itself help wildfire magnitudes in the future? Not by itself, right? So reforestation, absent of, say, the application of fire in reforestation, that idea of pyrosilviculture, and a paper just came out this week. We tried to identify the need or illustrate the need for including fire in young stands in that Reforestation for Resilience paper in Forest Ecology and Management. Just an individual paper on pyrosilviculture came out this week. Certainly important to have other tricks up your sleeve or other tools as part of that that full complement when you're thinking about reforestation. But setting these, the way that you set these systems up, right, this kind of idea of priority effects has an influence on kind of what comes together down the line, and it certainly gets you on good footing, but it's not the end all be all at all. Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, the sad thing is I didn't show or talk to any data about the the backlog that is kind of comparing what we're doing or what we're able to do per the need of reforestation, but we're kind of just scratching the surface. As part of the memorandum of understanding and the shared stewardship spirit between the state of California and U.S. Forest Service Region 5, there is an agreement to treat 500,000 acres each every year. So that's 1 million acres per year, including reforestation. So that will help get us up to scale. But yeah, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, to be sure. Yeah, please. Yeah, we're here to help, right? So it's lovely. I mean, the Climate Up programs were USDA, so we are all across the country, and if you're in different parts of the country, I'd say reach out to your hub. But we were all designed to be engaged with our land grant institutions, and for us in California, it's the UC system, and of course, for what we're doing, UC Davis was the far and away best place for us to be, and we're situated right on campus, have great relationships with our academic partners, and we don't try to do everything. We don't try to do nearly everything ourselves. We have great partners and collaborators and colleagues that if there are issues or problems, we have the right kind of complement of experts we can reach to help address those needs. It's a really lovely relationship. I'm really thankful to be a part of it.
Wonderful. I think we have one more question before we close out.
Yeah.
How much of the research and science is latitude specific? In other words, how much is directly applicable to northern forests?
Yeah, so the work that I presented, I think in concept it has applicability, but a lot of, so like, for example, and when we're saying northern forest, I don't know if the northern forest mean like the Pacific Northwest forests or like the northern forest in the northern kind of the Great Lakes region or what, but there's a lot of good. The Northern Forest Climate Hub is its own climate hub, so you can check them out. They're forest specific. But yeah, I think in concept, I mean, we're working with California problems, with California delineations, with California data. It's not something that you would use to make projections onto Oregon, Washington, or Idaho. Certainly, I wouldn't recommend doing that. I'd recommend reaching out to the Northwest Climate Hub or even the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is kind of our USGS counterpart. They're also, Nicole DeCrepio is the director of that one, and Jessica Kolofsky is the director of the Northwest Climate Hub. They're both fantastic and can point you in the direction if you need help in northern latitudes. But yeah, I wouldn't take tools that were built on data from one location and apply them to another place. The seed lot selection tool is one such product that's been developed in the Pacific Northwest, based on largely, it's starting to use California data, I believe, but it's not something I would use to project onto, say, Southern California, because it's using Oregon data, right? You have to know, it's always good to know what's under the hood before you start making decisions using tools that were built for other places, if that makes sense. Looking carefully at it.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. We look forward, we will be sharing this recording with everybody, but if anybody has any further follow-up questions, I put his email address in the chat. And of course, as you mentioned, you can reach out to them at their USDA Climate Hub website. Yeah. Otherwise, I hope everybody has a great rest of your day.
Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks, Sandra. Nice seeing you. Bye now.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.